Yeah, I think that Johnston has not been fully appreciated as really the father of 20th century typography, or the return to the classical forms which happened in the 20th century typography. Um, I don't. I think, there's a beginning. It was very encouraging to see at this conference all the attention which Johnston received. It's a testimony to the fact that he still is in people's minds. He still is a clear presence after a little over 100 years. And I think there's no question that that influence has a lot of momentum. And as I said, both in terms of the revival of the forms which came very directly from the scribal tradition in the 15th century, and also this development of what we now call the sans serif letter. The invention that happened in the 15th century was not actually the invention of the printing press. The printing press was already present. There are wood blocks used for printing playing cards and various things. The real invention of the 15th century was what we call movable type. Movable type meant that you had each separate character cast on a piece of metal. The pieces of metal could then be assembled together to make up the text, whatever that was. In order to make these little pieces of lead, you needed to sculpt the form of the letter on the end of a bar of steel. This process was not writing, even though the earliest typefaces, the earliest Roman typefaces, were very clearly based on the pen-written, the edge-pen-written forms of the late 15th century. Even in the first Roman typefaces, beginning particularly with Jensen and then Aldus, Nicholas Jensen is still regarded by many people as having made the finest letter forms in the Roman tradition. There was a lecture at this conference on the revival of his letters in the earliest 20th century by a very well-known book designer and ultimately a letter designer from New England, Bruce Rogers, who made a typeface called Centaur. There was just a few years ago another revival of this typeface, and there have been a lot of them actually. And then the typefaces and the whole publishing effort of Aldus Manutius, along with a man named Francesco Grifo. Francesco Grifo was the punch cutter that Aldus used to make the types for his books. Already you can see in those very first Roman types an attempt to resolve the graphic tension, the visual tension that existed between these two forms, the forms from the right around the birth of Christ, which were the imperial Roman letter forms, which had been combined really for the first time with forms that were what we call lowercase, forms that have parts that stick up and down and are our familiar forms that we read. This was a new thing. This was a revival. This was a departure from the forms, the heavy vertical forms of Gothic writing. And the resolution of these two somewhat compatible forms, they were both written with an edge tool, but at very different times. And they clearly, if you're the designer of letters, one of the things that concerns you is this purely visual matter of trying to have a system of form in which everything appears to be compatible and harmonious. In almost every writing system, we find this development of, of the scribal tradition working out a system so that there are components, there are elements which are combined together to make the letters, and therefore they, having been made out of similar parts and so on, that they have a relationship to one another. They look visually comfortable to read, and this is the thing that was overturned with the invention of movable type. The reason that it was overturned is because of the activity of the punch cutter. The punch cutter worked in isolation. The punch cutter was not part of the writing tradition. Even at the end of the 15th century, this appears to be true. The people who did this punch cutting were not scribes. They were goldsmiths. They were people who were used to working with metal. And even though they used scribal models, they began to work out this system of trying to resolve the tension between the Roman capital letter and the minuscule letter, the lowercase letter. Okay, now, in the Gothic tradition, which continued on, there was not this tension. The Gothic tradition had been going for several hundred years, 200-300 years. The whole issue of how you make capital and lowercase compatible had been solved. The way it was solved was they invented capitals to go with the lowercase, and they have the same flavor as the lowercase, and consequently you find very little change in what we call the black letter, the Gothic letter, over time when it was converted into type. So you look at Gutenberg's letter forms, they look exactly like a manuscript. In fact, these earliest books were probably sold on the, as if they were written books. The whole attempt was to make a thing that could be manufactured much more cheaply. Obviously, you can reproduce them, but with the Roman types, I think already that had gone away. There wasn't really an attempt to do that anymore. It was clear that these books were printed. But the isolation of the punch cutter, not part of the scribal tradition, produces a very different situation as far as the forms of the letters are concerned. You are cut loose in a way from the underlying structure of the forms. You no longer have a pen angle, you no longer have a sequence of strokes. You have simply the appearance of the letter forms. And as time goes on, and the punch cutters simply are not communicating with the next generation of punch cutters, there is no pedagogy of punch cutting. We have no record whatsoever of how the punch cutters worked up until in the 18th century, basically, is the first time there's a book about type founding, and even that is not very forthcoming on that issue. So what happened was, as people started to work out in their heads rather than with their hands and from a tradition how the letter forms were made, they change. And they change in ways which ultimately result in the 19th century and what was considered by a great many people at the beginning of the 20th century to be degenerate. There are many factors. A big one is the beginning of the industrial era and commerce and advertising, and so you get a development of letter forms to meet the needs of that world, and the letter forms that result are in this situation where they can really be played with and distorted and so on in any way you wish, because there is no tradition anymore of how this underlying structure was made. So the effect of that was that I think when Johnston did his work, it was not motivated at all by trying to solve any problems of letterform construction. He simply was devoted to this form from a young age. Apparently, he was fascinated by letters. He wanted to know how they were made in the manuscripts, and he rediscovered it. He reconstructed it, and he established, by being a writing teacher himself and writing the writing book, writing and illuminating and lettering in 1906, he reestablishes the tradition. He basically picks up what was lost in the 15th century, reinvigorates it, and teaches many devoted students, and has a tremendous effect on what then happened in type design in the 20th century. The German aspect of this, which is an interesting one, because the Germans have had a serious effect on the typographic and type design in the 20th century, particularly in the late 20th century. The Germans are the German-speaking countries, the only place where the Gothic tradition had continued, and these Gothic typefaces continued to be made and so on, in Germany up until World War II. And in the beginning of Hitler's time, you can see these Gothic letters used in it. I must say they are truly frightening the way they're used. They have such power. They're very visually powerful, and I think that goes back to their source, their intended use in the medieval world, which was not really to be read. It was to impress visually the people who saw them. Many of them probably couldn't read anyway. But finally Hitler decides, or Hitler's minions decide, and he decides that it's not a good idea to continue the Gothic letter tradition, because when he conquered the West and the rest of the world, they were going to need to communicate with them in a letter form that they understood. So they banned the Gothic letter and converted to Roman letter forms. When they did that, there was Johnston's teaching waiting for them. And it's fascinating to look at the letter forms which occurred in the 50s, even late 40s and 50s, by German designers who had then, by force of, the power of the Third Reich, had to abandon the Gothic form and adopt the Roman form. Some of them liked the Roman form already. These are very, well-informed designers. One of these people was Rudolf Koch. Koch spanned the era, but then there was Paul Renner, who designed Futura, the typeface Futura, which was immensely popular and influential. He was clearly influenced by Johnston, and on to I think Ernst Schneidler. There are all these people in German graphic world who have had a strong influence. Probably the most well known being Hermann Zapf, the designer of Palatino and Optima, and very influential in the typography and the type design of today. I would say still going on. He was one of my heroes when I was beginning myself. He also influenced I think the interest in the revival of the classical typefaces that were from the early days of printing, the typefaces of Jensen, the typefaces of Aldus. And he established, there were enough teachers that, and the book, well, Hermann Zapf learned from the book. He didn't learn from another teacher. My own teacher, Edward Johnson, Lloyd Reynolds, learned from Johnson's book. And so I am a direct product, really, of the Johnston tradition. Um, and this list goes on and on. It's very difficult to, once again, to really trace all of these lines as they go out because there are so many. I think his influence is a thing which we will continue to dwell on and discover. He was a remarkable person, really, very. In a way, he was not formally educated. He was educated at home. He was what we now call a homeschooler. And he was clearly fascinated by mathematics, by Euclid. He was fascinated by Plato. And so he's a very deep intellect, but not an intellect which was connected to the traditional academic training of his time. And so I think actually in a way that probably gave him a little bit of insulation and a little bit of freedom to to go his own way, to follow this path that he worked out for himself in studying the manuscripts and then trying to teach the things that he had discovered to others. And he was thrown into it at a rather tender age by Letheby, who he was inscripted basically, and to teach. And the teaching was clearly his path. I mean, he did teach for 30 years, something like that, and many devoted students. And when you look at the book, it is graphically not of the industrial era. It is not slick. It is not perfect. It is very clearly handmade, and it is in a way naive typographically. He uses italics, small capitals, things overrun each other. They are sort of oddly put on the page, and everything about it has a feeling of intimacy and and true devotion and a real desire to communicate to you exactly what he meant. I think that's probably why the book has been in print for 101 years. Quite remarkable, really.